Daniel Murray, you are Chief Economist at EFG Asset Management. What do you expect of the Fed policy in terms of tapering in the next few months?
I think the Fed has indicated quite clearly what we should expect for Fed tapering for this year. What they've said, both in Fed minutes and also what Yellen has hinted at in her recent testimony, is that we should expect the Fed to taper by 10 billion at every meeting throughout this year. So they started the year adding 85 billion in asset purchases per month. They've indicated they'll do 10 billion a month, 10 billion at each meeting. They've got 8 meetings this year, so that brings us back to zero roughly at the end of the year.
When do you expect the interest rates go up?
I think the hurdle for interest rate hikes is quite high. And again, that's consistent with what we've heard from Fed minutes and from what we've heard when Fed governors and from Yellen's testimony. So I think there's quite a number of things that have to happen before the Fed is going to hike rates. First of all, the economic environment has to be robust enough that the Fed feels comfortable hiking rates. And for that to happen, we'd have to see a meaningful improvement in the labour market metrics, things like a stabilisation in the participation rate, reduction in the number of temporary workers, a reduction in the number of part-time workers, and alongside a fall in the unemployment rate and perhaps some wage inflation. You'll also have to see signs of an increased, meaningful and sustained improvement in activity, so things like industrial production metrics, more robust consumption metrics, and perhaps a pickup in capex indicative of an increase in consumer confidence. And I think the final part of that is we'd have to start to see some pressures on capacity. So not just wage inflation, but indication that pressures are moving in terms of general prices, and there's some upward pressure on inflation rates. So I think if you take into account all that's got to happen before the Fed can hike rates, then rate hikes are already quite some way off. And we certainly don't expect them until the middle of next year at the very earliest.
If the interest rates increases, what would that mean for the financial markets?
I think the relationship between interest rates and markets is often not well understood, particularly the relationship between equity markets. Now, what the Fed has indicated, and as we've just heard, they're unlikely to raise rates until and unless the economic environment is sufficiently robust that the Fed believes the economy can take that. Additionally, because we're coming out of what's quite an unusual economic cycle, the Fed has indicated that they're going to be behind the curve. So in other words, they're going to have to be really confident and really comfortable that the economy is strong enough to be able to take a tightening of credit before they're going to hike rates. Now you put that together, and what that spells out is that the corporate environment is likely to be quite good at the point in time when the Fed is hiking rates. And in turn, we believe that that's likely to be a reasonable environment for equity markets.
What are, in your opinion, very important economic topics in the US for the next few years?
I think one that's dominated the headlines over the past few months is shale. And whilst I don't expect this to impart a massive cyclical kicker to US growth, I think the underlying story is going to persist for some time. It's going to give US businesses and US households access to a cheap and reliable source of energy for very many years. Just to put this in perspective, the quantum of proven reserves at the moment is sufficient to sustain around 13 years of demand at current rates of consumption. If you add to that other reserves, the quantum of technically recoverable reserves as defined by the EIA is equivalent to about 95 years worth of consumption at current rates. So there's a significant amount of energy. It's more than just a drop in the ocean, and it's likely to be an underlying story in the US for a great many years to come.